Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Peter Turchin. He is emeritus professor at the University of Connecticut. He is also a project leader at the Complexity Science Hub Vienna. And today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the main topics he's been working on throughout his life. I also want to mention that his latest book is The Great Holocene Transformation. So, Dr. Turchin, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I would like to ask you first, and I hope we have time to get a little bit more into detail here, but what causes political communities to cohere and what causes them to fall apart? Because this is something that you've worked on.
Well, that's a huge question. So you probably want to break it up into smaller questions. Let's start by talking about about what causes political communities to cohere, because that's the subject of my latest book, as you mentioned, The Great Holocene Transformation. I should warn your listeners that this is an academic book. It's not a popular book. If you want to read a popular introduction to these ideas, I have another book which I published about in 2015 called Outer Society. All right.
Okay.
So the ideas are the general theory which underlies my understanding of the evolution of large-scale complex societies is explained in Outer Society, and now it has been extensively tested empirically with a massive data set we have collected since then, using what we call the SHAT, the Global History Data Bank. Right. So let's talk about a quick introduction. Human species is considered to be about 200,000 years old. All right, and for 97% of our history, actually, well, for 95% of our history, evolutionary history, we've lived in small-scale societies numbering in some hundreds or maybe low thousands. And then in the last 10,000 years, during the geological epoch called the Holocene, all right, suddenly the scale and complexity of human societies literally exploded. There are some states on Earth that number more than 1 billion individuals, and many large states have hundreds of millions living in them. So this is a huge change. And one part of my research has been addressing the question, how can we understand it? What were the mechanisms and evolutionary forces that resulted in this change?
But I mean, what are perhaps the main mechanisms that you would say play a role in political societies evolving, growing larger, scaling up, and so on?
Yeah, well, there are many theories. In fact, there are hundreds of special theories, but there are several general themes. Some people point to the adoption of agriculture, and there is a general consensus, which includes myself, that adoption of agriculture was a necessary condition, but not sufficient, because there are many regions on Earth, such as New Guinea, for example, that had agriculture for many thousands of years, but did not develop states until they were colonized by Europeans. All right. So then other theories there are some other theories which are functional theories. They basically point to some function that states fulfill and try to understand the evolution of states by appealing to this function. And then there are many theories which include various kinds of coercion. Some theories talk about internal violence. So the famous Marx and Engels theories. Other theories talk about external coercion and warfare. So the theory that I've been working on, which I think is the best, it is both theoretically the best justified, all right, and it is also empirically supported. This theory arises in the new discipline of cultural evolution, and it's called cultural multi-level selection. The main idea there that it was a competition between societies, or rather, to be more precise, polities. A polity is a politically independent organization that includes, the states, empires, modern nation states, chiefdoms of various kinds, and also small-scale societies such as agricultural Neolithic villages, or even hunter-gatherer camps and small-scale societies of this kind. So CMLS, cultural multi-level selection theory, focuses on competition between polities and assigns that as the driving force in evolution of complex societies. Essentially, the idea is fairly simple, and it is present already in Charles Darwin. So the idea is that competition between societies, especially during the Holocene, when it took the form of warfare, drove evolution of large scale, simply because larger scale polities have a better advantage over small scale polities, both in defense and perhaps collective predation. All right, but also in order to keep the in order to grow to large scale without falling apart, you need many new institutions. So it was this competition between polities that selected for larger and larger both scale and institutional complexity.
Do we have a good understanding of the factors that contribute to the collapse of complex societies? Because, I mean, we tend to hear many different theories. Some of them do not seem to have lots of scientific support. Others seem to have a little bit more. But what do we know about what causes the collapse of complex societies?
Well, there are many theories, and let me just step back for a moment. So the theory of cultural multi-level selection, how do we know that it is supported? First of all, you want to know that it is internally consistent, and the only way to do that is to translate theory into mathematical models. All right, so we have both analytically solved mathematical models, and of course more realistic computational models called agent-based simulations. So these models actually tell us that if we that the set of assumptions we make about how large-scale complex societies evolved actually is consistent, because when we translate them into mathematical models, these models generate the dynamics that we propose to happen. And of course, then the models are also very important because we can extract quantitative predictions from them and then test those predictions with data. So in my book, The Great Holocene Transformation, I go through this both modeling material and empirical material. All right, so now back to your question. Again, there are many theories about why complex societies may collapse. What we know is that it's not even inevitable. Okay, first of all, let's again step back. So one very theory which many people talk about is Joseph Tainter, which the theory that says that complex societies collapse because they become too complex. They acquire too much complexity. This is called sometimes complexity overhang. And so those societies collapse because they have too much complexity. But the theory that I and my colleagues advocate actually says that most complexity that evolved, such as institutional complexity and technological complexity and many other things, that's actually useful complexity. And in fact, they make societies more stable or more resilient, actually. So they can adapt to new conditions without falling apart. All right. So the theory that I and my colleagues favor is called structural demographic theory. And that theory is actually explained in another book, End Times, which was published about 2 or 3 years ago.
Yes.
And so people can actually find out the details there. All right, but very briefly, what we see is that complex societies organized as states appeared about 5,000 years ago, really in the last 2 or 3% of our evolutionary history. So they're very novel. And the first ones were quite fragile, and they had a high probability of collapsing. But as they accumulated more institutions, they became more resilient to forces of collapse. And so we see this that as we approach today, we see first of all that even though societies periodically get stressed, they are much less likely to have a complete collapse. So they just have a series of civil wars or revolutions, which they live through and then reconstitute themselves. All right, and the periods of this instability they have become shorter. All right, but the general rule still remains that all complex societies, including our own, experience these periodic waves of internal instability, roughly at about 200 or 300 century intervals.
And how did you arrive at that 200-300 year interval? I mean, and do you have an explanation as to why that sort of interval occurs? Why we have those sorts of cycles, let's say?
Yeah, so these are not perfectly periodic mathematical cycles. Rather, it's more like maybe the better word would be boom bust dynamics. First of all, how do you know that this happens? Well, in our brand of science, which we call cliodynamics, from Clio, the muse of history, and dynamics, the science of change. All right, we treat history just as any other natural or social sciences, which means that we want to quantify various processes that we observe in history, and specifically talking about instability. My research group has spent devoted a lot of energy and time and resources to quantifying instability. So how do we do it? Well, first of all, we look to recorded histories, and we simply record all kinds of political violence events that may range from micro-violence events, such as an urban riot or a rural insurrection that may result in killing a few people. So we only look at events which are lethal, because that's first of all, that's clear that this is violence, right? And secondly, they're much more likely to be recorded, right? And then the scale of these events goes all the way to full-blown civil wars or transformative revolutions that may kill, sometimes millions, or even in some cases, tens of millions of people. So what we do is, one approach is we collect data on such events, and then we look at the statistical distribution of such events. And what we find when we do it, we find that complex societies organized in states may function reasonably well for a century or so, while keeping internal peace. So we would see very low incidence of political violence events, and they would be small in scale. All right, but then inevitably periods of end times arrive, and then we often see centuries, sometimes even longer, periods of disintegration, disintegrative phases during which you have social turbulence, political violence, sometimes leading to collapse, meaning that a substantial proportion of population either disappears, either dies off, is killed, or they run away. All right, we see a collapse of states that lose central authority and fragment into smaller scale polities and things like that. So collapse is not inevitable, but it is actually fairly frequent during those disintegrative phases. And then somehow, and then sometimes societies just collapse and are never seen again. So, for example, in what's now Pakistan, Indus Valley, the Indus Valley civilization was quite amazing civilization for several hundred years. And then it collapsed to the point where it disappeared. We don't even know what language they spoke. All right, and there was a period of when there were no large-scale settlements, cities, no evidence of large-scale societies. Yes, so some societies experience such collapses. Other famous examples of collapses, such as the Maya states, in fact, they after some period. Other Mayan polities arose, maybe not in exactly the same position, but in the same general area. And as a result of that, the Mayan people are still, they still live in Yucatan, in Mexico, and they still speak their language, which is descendant of what they spoke, and so on and so forth. And then other societies don't collapse, so we see these waves of instability, as I mentioned, 200 or 300 years, 2 to 3 centuries. So, for example, right now we live in such a wave of instability. That's very clear. The previous one is called the Age of Revolutions, roughly speaking, from 1789 to maybe beginning of 20th century, so 19th century. Before that, we had the general crisis of the 17th century. Before that, the late medieval crisis, and so on back into the past. We see every 2 or 3 centuries, recurring waves of instability. And as I said, as we get closer to today, these waves of instability result in lesser probability of utter collapse. Societies manage to somehow solve those problems and reconstitute themselves.
So later in our conversation, I hope we get the time to get more into the current instability we're going through right now. But I would like to ask you now particularly about one concept that you've been working on a lot, that is the one of elite overproduction. So could you tell us about that, what elite overproduction is and what leads to it?
Yes, in fact, talking about these waves of instability, they have a complex of forces, but one of the most important ones, and certainly the one which is most commonly present during these periods, is what we call elite overproduction. So this is a short term. What we mean actually is that first, let me just give you some definitions. First of all, who are the elites? This is simply a neutral sociological definition. A small proportion of the population, 1, 2, sometimes more percent, who concentrate social power in their hands. And social power includes such varieties as military power, administrative power, economic power, and ideological or persuasion So what's important about elites is how they are reproduced. Obviously, people age and retire or die, and so they need to be replaced. So people who would like to replace, who would like to become parts of elites, we call them, elite aspirants. These are elite wannabes, and there are always more elite aspirants than there are positions for them. And this results in competition, which, when it's reasonable, it's a good thing, because we want better candidates to succeed, rather than just allow everybody to become a power holder. But the problem is that sometimes the number of elite aspirants begins to overwhelm the number of positions. So it's not just like, let's say 50% more, or twice as many, like 3 times, 5 times, even 10 times. And so once we see such intense competition, that's actually counterproductive, because so many elite aspirants are frustrated in their goals. And many of them are quite good, all right? And so they consider the situation to be blatantly unfair. And so some of them turn into counter-elites. And counter-elites, they're still people who wield power oftentimes, but they work against the established elite. So think about famous revolutionaries like Fidel Castro and Los Barbudos, for example, or Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and so on and so forth. All right, these are counter-elites. They wield power to overthrow the established elites. So, for example, the Romanov dynasty, in the case of the Bolsheviks, and install themselves as the new established elites. Right. So, the long term would be overproduction of elite aspirants, but we just shorten it to elite overproduction, and that is in fact the essentially ubiquitous condition leading to major crisis, typically resulting in revolutions, civil wars, or some periods of really high social turbulence and political violence.
So, and would you say that we are witnessing right now elite overproduction in several countries, particularly I'm going to focus on the West here, due to the expansion of higher education and the fact that since around the last great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, many of those people who have attended higher education can no longer get access to the well-paid jobs that they would like to.
Yeah, well, things are a bit more complicated than that. Let's use the example of the United States, the country that I know from inside, because I've lived there for for all of my adult life. And also, the United States has actually entered this period of instability earlier than Western European countries or East Asian countries such as Japan and South Korea, right, which is similar. So, this is why it's a good example to use. In fact, back 16 years ago, almost 16 years ago, I published a forecast that suggested that United States was on the road to a crisis that would peak during the 2020s. So let me unpack, let me tell you what was the basis of my prediction and how it works. So, elite overproduction has been developing in the United States, and it was very obvious by 2010 when I made this prediction. So what is the cause of it? All right. What happened was that United States was, until about 1970s, United States was in many ways a very highly socially democratic country. In fact, it could be thought of almost as a Nordic country, similar to Denmark, Sweden, and so on and so forth. And as a result of that, the economic inequality has been declining from the beginning of the 20th century until 1980 or so. But during the 1970s, several changes were adopted by the governing elites at the time, which resulted in reversing this trend. So specifically, many people think about the Reagan revolution, but in fact, it started even earlier under Carter. Essentially, this resulted in taking away much of the power that workers had to organize and to push for their salaries, and many other factors which resulted, which I described at length in my book End Times. So let me just summarize things. So what happened was that prior to 1970s, the compensation of American workers was increasing together with their productivity.
Yes.
Right. And then in late 1970s, what happened, that productivity continued to increase, but the compensation, the wages and so on, stagnated and even declined. So that difference between those things had to go somewhere. And where did it go? It went to the elites, primarily economic elites, but also political and other types of elites. All right. So I call this process the wealth pump. It was essentially this mechanism that was taking wealth from the majority of population, the non-elite population, and gave it to the elites. So this had three consequences. First of all, it resulted in stagnation and even decline of well-being of the majority of population. So in our jargon, we call it popular immiseration. And this was true immiseration because eventually it resulted in biological measures of well-being, such as life expectancy or average population height, stature, declining as a result of American workers losing ground. Right. So this immiseration also results in increased mass mobilization potential, because people are upset about, they know that prior to that, every generation, American generation, lived better than the previous one. But that changed. And so over the last couple of generations, actually live worse than their parents, and that causes a lot of discontent. All right. So the second thing was that this wealth had to go somewhere, and it resulted in a massive increase of power of wealth holders. So, for example, or households that have $10 million of wealth or more, this is in inflation-adjusted dollars, all right, deca-billionaires. Their numbers over the past 40 years increased tenfold. The population has grown by 40%, but we have 10 times as many of such uber wealthy. And as you go up, you get this gets more and more blown out. So, for example, at the level of billionaires, again, if we adjust for inflation, cut off, we have 20 times as many billionaires now compared to 40 years ago. So wealth holders are, this is an example of elite overproduction, because in our societies, such as United States, Western Europe, and so on, we are governed by a coalition of economic elites and administrative elites, right? And of course, the balance of power changes depending on what country we're talking about. So, for example, United States, wealth holders really dominate. Whereas in countries like France, it's the administrative elites. And how they get on? Oh, I'll get to that. They who have more power, but that's been changing too. That's dynamic. Anyway, so having too many wealth people is a problem because many of them want to become play a role in the politics, and so you have this huge overproduction, tenfold overproduction compared to 40 or 50 years ago. Okay, so this is the second consequence. We talked about popular immiseration and overproduction of wealth holders. The third consequence is that as the general population immiserates, then what this is now known as precarity. Though people become part of precariat, which means that they live on the edge or even below the edge. So that creates an incredible push factor for people to escape that. And how do you do that? Well, in our societies, you go to college, all right? And then as the college degree becomes devalued, but too many people getting it, you get an advanced degree, such as law degree or PhD and things like that. And so this force results in overproduction of credentialed individuals. So elite overproduction has two aspects: too many wealth holders and too many credential holders, right? And they both have the same problems because we have too many elites. And this is the really explosive combination. It's having too many overproduced elite aspirants who are well organized, right, and mass mobilization potential, which provides the raw force, all right, and gets organized and channeled by counter elites. That's the worst combination, resulting in oftentimes state collapse or civil wars and or revolutions.
Okay, so let me ask you then. In the early 2010s, as you said, you predicted, based on what you've just mentioned, that there would be worldwide social unrest in the 2020s. Looking at the world right now, as it is right now, do you think that your hypothesis has been validated and in your terms or not?
I actually didn't say about anything worldwide. I was focusing on North America and Western Europe. And also, Western Europe was at the time behind the United States. You can see this quite clearly, that by looking at when did inequality is not a driving force in our theory, but inequality is a good indicator. Right. So between the elite overproduction and immiseration is recorded by observing larger economic inequality. So we can see that inequality started growing first in the United States, and then at 10-20-year lag time, we see the same processes taking over in Western Europe. Or Japan, and so they are behind the United States, right? And other countries like China, for example, or Russia, they actually have their own dynamics, and they are not part of this prediction.
Okay,
right? And so, obviously, the whole point of publishing this prediction was not to predict the future, which is essentially impossible, but this is called scientific prediction. How do we know that some theory is better than another one? We extract predictions from them, and those predictions don't have to be about the future. They could be about past, for example. So we could test theories in past societies, right? Yes. But so the point is to see which theories actually work better. At the time when I published my prediction in 2010, there were rival theories. So, for example, Steven Pinker published several books, and he confidently predicted that violence would be declining. And political violence was indeed declining in the years before 2010. But structural demographic theory, the theory that we work upon, was tracing the deep forces in societies, all right? And those forces have been actually, these pressures were developing for the previous, 30 years or so. And that's why we were predicting this trend reversal, that the trend to becoming more peaceful is actually would be reversed. And lo and behold, after 2010, this is precisely what happened.
And do you still believe, because we are now in late 2025, do you believe that a civil war could happen in the US in the 2020s?
In fact, I argue, and I have argued on my Substack, that we are in a true revolution. Ever since Donald Trump became president in January of this year, I would say that we are in a true revolution, as indicated by two developments. First of all, it's a revolution of the elites. So the MAGA movement, led by Trump, is a typical counter-elite movement. And so there was a concerted, and unlike this first term back in 2016, 2020, now there was a true attempt to replace the ruling class, the previous ruling class, and replace them with MAGA personnel. All right, so that's one criterion. The second one is that it's an attempt at transformative revolution. So it attempts to transform the American society in a variety of ways. So, for example, the abolition of DEI, wokeness, and so on. That's one aspect of it. But another one, a very obvious one, is an attempt to change the role that the United States plays on the international arena. Essentially, Trump is dismantling the American empire, right? So that's a huge transformation. So far, thankfully, this has been relatively nonviolent revolution. So elites that, the former elites that don't get their heads cut off with guillotines, right? But rather fired, all right? But and that's actually good. But there is definitely a high potential of violence spiraling out of control. So that possibility is non-zero. That's for sure.
Looking at potential examples of non-violent ends to elite overproduction, I mean, first of all, could you give us a historical example of that? And do you think that there's still space and opportunity for us to do the same in the current context?
So the question is how inevitable is serious violence, right? Is that, if I understand?
Yes, basically, yes.
Yeah, so let's go back to the previous wave of such political disintegration, which is, as I mentioned, the age of revolutions. Especially if you look at 1748 and the succeeding years, this was this middle of the 19th century. There were revolutions and civil wars worldwide. The famous revolutions of 1748 that affected most of Europe, but also if you think about it, just shortly following them, there was a civil war in the United States, 1860 on, and there was a huge civil war in China, known as the Taiping Rebellion, which resulted in the most destructive civil war ever. The number of people killed were somewhere between 20 and 50 million people. So this was a really worldwide wave of revolutions. However, some societies escaped it. So, for example, the British Empire was under huge pressure, and there was at the micro level, there were lots of instability events, such as riots and some massacres and things like that. But it never escalated into a full-blown civil war or revolution. So the British Empire managed to solve that problem. And another example is Russian Empire. Russian Empire also was under huge pressure. But both British Empire and Russian Empire managed to adopt a series of reforms, right? Very deep reforms in UK that resulted in democratizing, giving common people voting rights, and also abolishing some of the laws which resulted in huge immiseration, like the Koran laws. In Russia, it was the period called the Great Reforms, really changed the nature of society. Now, of course, this was temporary. In Russia, Russia managed to solve problems for about 50 years. And then it still went into the revolutions in the early 20th century. And the British Empire also eventually collapsed by 1960s. Well, starting with India becoming independent and so on and so forth. So any of such solutions are always temporary, because then you have to deal with rising unrest again. However, still, we see that it is possible to avoid really bloody revolution. And I hope that humanity is collectively learning. What do I mean by that? Well, we are accumulating institutions and technologies that decrease the probability of violent rupture. So the spread of democratic norms, for example, in the last a couple of hundred years, and also increasing technologies which actually make us more wealthy, more affluent, right? So all of that is working to help us avoid the worst. So my hope is that eventually humanity will learn. Some of these ways of instability actually are not necessarily bad, because the societies need to renew themselves. We get too set in our ways. The elites become too selfish, and so some kind of revolution of elites is necessary. But my hope is that we will be able to do it in non-violent ways. In fact, the initial promise of democracy was that it would allow elite replacement in peaceful ways. Unfortunately, so far, it has not really worked that well. All right, so we just need to evolve more to be able to solve our problems in non-violent ways.
Do you think we still have time for just one more question, please?
Yeah, one last question. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one last question then. Do you think that looking back at what was done in the US, in the UK, and elsewhere in the 1950s, 1960s, and up until around the mid-70s, where there was lots of economic redistribution and there was higher upward social mobility, do you think that there's space for us to go back to some of those solutions to improve or to decrease social unrest and solve some of the problems we are dealing with today?
Essentially, what happens, because this process is cycling, we see this happens after the age of revolutions, and resulting in really unprecedented prosperity in the United States and much of the world. In fact, And we see that happening after the 17th century crisis, after the the late medieval crisis. They were followed by a great expansion of human well-being. We can document it. And so yes, this is what this. In fact, this is a condition. In the expansion, increasing well-being results when the wealth pump gets shut down, or even reversed, so that the elites actually lose ground, become fewer of them. For example, in the United States, between the New Deal and 1980, the numbers of millionaires declined, and their wealth has also declined. And that resulted in much better, a much more balanced society. So this is what we will have to do in order to navigate ourselves through the crisis that we are experiencing right now. All right. So, yes, humanity has done this before, and so we will do it again. We just have to be careful not to self-immolate in a nuclear Armageddon, but in principle, it is solvable. The only thing is that the combination of reforms and policies is likely to be different from that, for example, which was used in the United States during the progressive era and the New Deal, because our societies have changed, all right? And that means that we will have to use a different, and also our challenges are different, because, for example, we have now artificial intelligence replacing jobs. It's a challenge with which you have to deal with. This is a novel challenge, and it will require its own, policy changes to address.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Turchin, I will be leaving links to your latest book and also to End Times and your other books in the description of the interview. Would you like just to tell us where people can find you and the rest of your work on the internet?
Sure. Well, first of all, I have a website. It's simply Peter Turchin, without any spaces, .com. All right. And then I started, earlier this year, I started a Substack. It's also called peterturchin.substack.whatever.com, I think. And so you can see links to all my works, which I update regularly on my website. And if you're interested, you can follow my thinking. I publish at least once a week. Usually on the weekend, I publish substantial pieces, and then often in midweek, like today, for example, I had a smaller, post about some developments, so you can follow those if you wish.
Yes, I will also be leaving links to that in the description of the interview. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been an immense pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.